Hello, everyone. During the last lessons, I stressed several times that Asian theologies try to do theology dialogically, through a dialogue. That's the first thing. And second, that doing theology this way is by itself a path towards confronting violence and building up reconciliation and peace. So those are bold statements and they are still a bit abstract. Though today and the lesson after, I would like to go more concretely in the way Asian theologies try to build themselves in a dialogical way. Maybe we can start with a quote that I used during our second lesson. In our context, dialogue must come first. Since in Asia, Christians are only a small minority, we dialogue through life situations with people of other faiths. Theology of harmony is part of the discussion and reflection on theology of dialogue. So let's take that as a kind of mission statement, if you want. The preferences were articulated very soon. We saw them, not only dialogue, but triple dialogue, with the poor of Asia, with their cultures, and with religious and philosophical tradition. And indeed, those three axes have been informing the vast majority of the documents that have been elaborated. For sure, there are many dialogical styles, and an Asian way of entering into dialogue differs from the style privileged by other civilizations. As Raymond Panicard says, dialogue is the optimism of the heart. Dialogue does not seem primarily to be a duologue, which will be dialectical, but a dialogue. So, etymologically speaking, a piercing of the logos, of the discourse, to attain a truth that transcends it. So let's be more concrete on that, and let's continue with what Panicard, a man versed both in Western and Indian tradition, has to say about that. A Christian cannot assume at the outset that he knows what a Buddhist means when speaking about nirvana and anatman, just as a Buddhist cannot immediately be expected to understand what a Christian means by God and Christ before they have encountered not just the concept, but the living concept, which include different ways of looking at reality. They have to encounter each other before any meeting of doctrine. Man indeed is not a monad, an individual. He is a person, which means a bundle of relationships. And human relationships require dialogue. In other words, without dialogue, without a dialogical life, man cannot attain a fully human condition. Man is animal loquence, speaking animal. But linguisticality is not only external communication. It is most of all inner communication. And Panicard means we first have to communicate with ourselves or within ourselves in order to communicate with other people. So the way of procedure, I'm continuing with Panicard, who has been one of the foremost Asian theologians on this issue, on this methodological issue. The way of procedure of the dialogical method is to let the knowledge and experience of other religions gained by one to interact through study, reflection, prayer, and contemplation with the faith affirmation of one's own community. That's important. I am part of the affirmation of my own community, but I need to interact with other communities. in order to correct oneself, to enrich oneself, to change oneself, but also to challenge the other. The two are not contradictory. Like any method in theology, the dialogical method too will be vindicated only by the theology it gives rise to. In other words, through dialoguing with other traditions, I will develop a theology that is consistent and has a value for the people who will meet with it. If this method is able to give a coherent elaboration of the deposit of Christian faith in a religiously pluralistic context, which is the context of all Asia, and the Christian community can recognize its faith in that elaboration, that's important too. I'm speaking also and maybe first most for my brothers and sisters, then the method can be said to be valid. Now, let me compare that with the importance of dialogue in ancient Chinese philosophy. There is a sinologist called Donald Holtzman who in 1956 wrote what I think is a seminal article which was called The Conversational Tradition in Chinese Philosophy. He was thinking of the fact that the Analects, Mencius, but also good part of the Chuangzi, actually almost all of the Chuangzi, and so on, are made of dialogue. Of course, there are other traditions, but dialogue has been the first expression of Chinese thought, or one of the first, and certainly the most developed one. And that the style of dialogue is, of course, very different from the one of Greek dialogues. So it's quite fascinating to compare the two. So what does Holtzman has to say about what he calls the conversational tradition? It is in the discussion of particular facts of human existence that Confucius, and after him the philosophers in the conversational tradition, produce their particular insight, short, incisive stabs into the human conditions. To organize his insights into a system would be to devitalize them. Therefore, his disciples have tried to keep them as close at their original, particular, concrete forms as possible, and have preserved this conversation or saying on different, particular occasions. The same can be said for all the later philosophers in the conversational tradition. And the fact that this can be said for later philosophers is important. It shows that the form of the conversations is not an archaism, the fumbling attempt of the first Chinese philosophers to put their idea pell-mell into some sort of order, but an integral part of Confucius' thought, and indeed an important clue to the character of Chinese thought in general. Confucius, like Socrates actually, but in a different fashion, could think only dialogically. He couldn't think in a monologue, he had to think in a dialogue. And in the same way, it can be said theology, you cannot approach God in a monologue, you approach him through dialogues, and the dialogue generated by the fact that people have different spiritual and cultural experiences. This makes us reflect on what is knowledge. You know, knowledge is a strange word because it refers to very different reality. I know what is the height of the mountains, for instance, but I know also what is the sound of a clarinet. But I can tell you how high is mountains. It's very difficult to communicate with you what is the sound of a clarinet, and so on and so on. I know I love this person. What kind of knowledge is that compared to a mathematical truth? But if we look at the big picture, I would say that knowledge may be of two kinds. It may refer to a given science, such as physics, or it refers to human beings considering their nature and their social setting. In the first case, dialogical exchanges are at the same level of reality as the one induced by mathematical formula, which means I just check with others whether my formula, my demonstration, or my facts are right. But in the second case, knowledge about human beings, the truth is not primarily mathematical. Dialogical exchange is no longer a mechanical process. It centers about establishing relationship between others. That's the only way I can know others. Verbal exchanges imply that to experience the very act of listening is a transformative process that cannot be separated from the ones who which truth is rich. Because I am transformed while listening to the other, I reach another level of truth. If I am not transformed through the exchange, I do not reach any other truth on the other. So the way of the dialogue determines what can be called categories of truth, the nature of the truth I am looking for. So let's have a look at different kinds of dialogue, because it will help us to understand what we do when we engage into dialogue with people of other faiths, especially in Asia. First, dialogue, as we said, can be a logical exercise in the context of hard sciences, for instance, that generate propositions meant to be universally valid, based on the principle of non-contradiction. In that way, I dialogue with a colleague like I monologue with myself when I try to determine whether my demonstration has mistakes in it or not. So sometimes dialogue is just part of the soliloquy I develop for demonstrating what is at stake. But even in that case, even in Aristotle, who speaks about that kind of dialogue, the presence of an interlocutor is required for ensuring the verisimilitude of facts and of assertion, okay? Especially the one of the doxa, of the opinion. It seems that I cannot be sure of what I say if someone does not confirm it to me. So in that respect, from the start, truth is never alone. Truth is to be shared, even when it comes to mathematical truth. Let's look now at the kind of dialogue, maybe the most famous one in philosophy, and they have been very influential in theology, that have been developed by Socrates. I suggest to look at them as a drama, as a theater play. Socratic dialogues are written as if they were played on a theatrical scene. The plot is that the very possibility of reaching agreement will be tested in various ways. Does Socrates and his contradictor agree at the end of the dialogue or not? There are drama that culminate into success or failure. And the trial of Socrates, who will be condemned to death, is a drama that becomes a tragedy. So it means that truth is the discovery of unity within the multiple, and it is shown by the progressive unity of soul and soul reached between the protagonists of the dialogue, or it is veiled by disagreement and rhetorical escapes. If truth is unity, the agreement of the interlocutor unveils truth. If agreement cannot be obtained, the truth itself is veiled by disagreement and rhetoric. After that, there is another kind of dialogue, which is called scholasticism. What is scholasticism? It means that within a school, it can be the medieval university or a Buddhist Tibetan monastery or other context, you have a body of works and people will debate and dialogue around this corpus, though they will not take everything for granted, or they will not base themselves only on reason and logic, but on the truth that they are content in the corpus they look at. For instance, in medieval scholasticism, you were looking at the same time in the Bible and in Aristotle. If what you were saying did not conform to the Bible and Aristotle, well, your assertion could not be received. Okay? Though the natural light is supplemented by a reference text, the one accepted by the school. It's still true today, you know, dialogue about Marxism are content within the corpus of Marxism, for instance. So the principle of non-contradiction is exercised within the readings of this text. Okay. So, for instance, when we look at theology as done at the time of scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, and so on, it was characterized not only by the privileged reference to a corpus, but by a method, the one of disputing a question. Okay? Disputing of question. One was trying through the dialectic as determined by Aristotle to shape theology into one form of science. So students were trained to see both sides of a problem, which is good, to learn the viewpoint of the ancient philosophers, to argue on behalf of their own opinion, to answer objections. The master found the question, the problem that was submitted to two students who had to debate around it, an excellent one on which to express their view, and so on and so on. So there is a dialogical wisdom already in European theology, but it was contained by the corpus represented by the Bible and by Aristotle. Let's go now towards another form of dialogue, the one represented by Confucianism, which I would call dialogues of life. Okay? The Analects show us a dialogue of life, which seeks to ensure that the disciple deeds coincide with a system of moral and cosmological beliefs, though Confucius doesn't test the logic of his disciple, he tests their consistency. Do what they do in life, for instance, when they are looking for an official appointment, coincide with the moral principle they have learned from him and adopted. Dialogue is a gateway through which to match truth and life. Truth is in life, not in logic. Thus, the dialogical form is not a device, but is linked to the nature of the truth to be reached and lived. Okay? So Confucius is looking for consistency, as medieval scholasticism does. But the consistency is mostly interested in is the one between speech and life attitudes. Actually, the gospel dialogical style is very close from the one of the Analects. There is just one difference. Let's say that Confucius will put the trust on acquired wisdom. Are my disciples becoming sage men, wise men in the course of the teaching as give them? While Jesus will insist on the decisions taken at a given moment by the disciple. When Jesus enters into a dialogue with someone, let's say the rich young man, John and James, when they come to see him for sharing in his glory and so on, the dialogue becomes a transformative process through which a decision is to be reached by the one who enters into a dialogue of life. Confucius insists on wisdom, Jesus insists on decision, but the decision is reached through dialogue. Well, there is a totally different kind of dialogue, but which is theologically very interesting, which is dialogue as enlightenment. Maybe you can think about Zen writing, when the master, for instance, asks you what was your face before you were born, which looks like a meaningless question, but you're supposed to meditate upon it till a kind of enlightenment takes place. Or the dialogue of Chuangzi, in which there are very gross things that are said. For instance, Chuangzi said, Tao can be found in excrements, things like that. And the people are shocked. And because they are shocked, there is a door that suddenly opens up. Though there are settings in which dialogue is meant to lead to enlightenment. The dialogue is pushed to a breaking point that challenges the principle of non-contradiction, that challenges logic itself, and brings participants to a sudden transformation of his consciousness and worldview. It happens actually in every life. Sometimes people say things to us, we are listening, and we are so shocked, so transformed by what they say, that suddenly we see the reality we're speaking about, maybe our own self, in a totally different way. And there is another kind of dialogue, which is the one pursued, for instance, in classical democracy, what is called democratic dialogue. But that can apply to some forms of interreligious dialogue, for instance. The point is that the process of listening is supposed to be mutually transformative. I insist on the mutually transformative. The dialogues we have seen till now often have as partners, for instance, a master and a disciple. Not always, but most of the time. The premises of the democratic dialogue is like everybody is equal. We have to listen to the opinion and experience of everyone, and everyone has to make concessions in order to reach a consensus. Okay? So it means, for instance, if we are trying to build a neighborhood, the mothers, the ones who every day go to work, the little children, the shop owners, and so on, everyone will tell the other what are their interests, their problems, the thing they have to be running. And from that, one will determine where the metro station should be located, how to conceive of the public space, how to conceive of safety for children or for families at large, and so on and so on. So of course, this is an ideal, but it means that dialogue, in the way it was developed from the 18th century on, let's say classical democracy as reshaped in America and in France, has been based on a principle of equality. Okay? But somehow, when different religions discuss together, they need to do that on the same footing. We all have a right to express our preoccupations, opinions, and experiences. Here, one important quote is the one by Habermas in a fundamental book of him, The Theory of Communicating Action. With the development of democratic societies, the authority of the holy is gradually replaced by the authority of an achieved consensus. Okay, so we see that under the term dialogue, there is an incredible variety of communication styles, of way of communicating with the others. Still, the word dialogue can be applied to all of them. There are different ways of conducting the dialogue, but in all cases, there is a listening process and there is a process of transformation. Basically, after doing that, one could divide all dialogues into two kinds. We can qualify of performative all dialogue in which a trust placed in the partner of the exchange allows for the transformative nature of the experience. What someone says about the way he's living or believing will transform my own experience. This is performative. It performs something. And dialogues that are engaged in order to verify compliance, adequacy of the theory to the facts, we all agree that this mathematical formula has no mistake in it, are just constitutive. They state a consensus being achieved on the basis of logic. So we can see dialogue as games. We play with words, we play with the other. Of course, it is a serious game, but they are language games in the sense that there are rules applied to them. This is a very simple experience. When I engage into dialogue with someone I don't know, instinctively, there are things I will not say at the beginning. I don't know his language level. I don't know his background. I don't know on which topic he's sensitive. So I will restrict the way we are going to speak together, the content and the style, until we'll do the same thing. For instance, at the beginning, we will not joke together because we don't know what joke is acceptable. And the more we know each other, the more the rules will enlarge, will become flexible. Or maybe there will be new rules because I saw that he couldn't accept at all the way I was speaking at this point. So I totally restrain myself of doing that. So you see, there are rules in the game we are playing with the other when dialoguing with them, and those rules are always evolving. Of course, what I say comes from Wittgenstein, but we maybe don't need to speak of so famous and intimidating a philosopher, but actually what he says is interesting because he speaks of games, and he says there are so many kinds of games: board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on and so on. And he says there is something common to them, but we are almost unable to say what is common to all those games, to the incredible variety of games. But still, we can call them games because we have an experience of games. That means that we will consider some as being games, and other activities are certainly being no games. Well, if I change the word game for the word dialogue, I will say the same thing. There is this astounding variety of dialogic forms I have spoken about, that I certainly forgot some form of dialogues pursued during history, but I still know when it is a dialogue and when it is not a dialogue. So Wittgenstein writes, I shall say games from a family. There are resemblances among games, like there are resemblances among the members of the same family. I don't know why the nephew looks a bit like the uncle, but I see that he belongs to the same family. And I will say in the same way, dialogues form a family. In other words, to know what a dialogue is or game is means to recognize the range of meaning of the term. Okay? And as I say, this is the knowledge of what is a dialogue or what is a game is a kind of knowledge. And that kind of knowledge lies somewhere between what it is to know the height of a mountain, of the Mont Blanc, and at the other extreme, what it means to know how a clarinet sounds. Those are all knowledge, but those are different forms of knowledge. So let's come back to interreligious dialogue as a vehicle for the building of Asian theology and also as a vehicle for building up peace and reconciliation. A dialogue of faith is a dialogue pursued among partners with different background that resembles first one of the symbol games. For instance, you play with a few building blocks, or you play with language constituted only with a few words that Wittgenstein speaks about. He says, let's speak of games first as a very, very simple form, and we are going to enrich it later on. I would say this is exactly what a dialogue of faith here. The first time I meet with a Taoist monk, if I come from France and don't understand much about Taoism, what I will say or what I will listen to is very simple. It's like playing with a few bricks, or with 3 or 4 words. But this will be progressively enriched once the pursuit of the game will have allowed both partners to build upon their experience of engaging the other. Dialogue here is an evolving language game, the rules of which can be changed and enriched by mutual consent. Speaking of game, of play, is very serious, actually. Life is a serious game by many ways, and we engage with all our heart in a dialogue. Indeed, we engage into a game that will somehow transform our life. And anyway, it's better to play games than to engage into war. Misunderstandings in dialogue usually happen when the rules governing the use of language are changed by one of the players. He is overconfident as to the degree of mutual comprehension that is reached. I think I can joke on that, and that people feel very offended about that. Though there is caution to be taken into dialogue. Dialogue can foster reconciliation, but it can also foster misunderstanding. So maybe dialogue is like rituals. Aha, another word we have seen now. So we have game, we have dialogue, we have rituals. All those words are important in Asian context. And maybe dialogues can be seen as ritual. We respect our rules, so as to enrich them, so as the understanding developing among the interlocutors will allow for the development of the syntax governing the exchange. If we display in dialogue the respect we display in ritual, it means how seriously we take our interlocutors and the setting of the dialogue, because we want it to grow, because we want the exchange to grow. So both Confucianism and Christianity consider rituals as a vector of respect and sharing. We share in ritual. Confucians share meat, for instance, meat for the ancestor in rituals. Christians, of course, share bread and wine as a way of growing forms of life that need to be protected and nurtured. Ritual is a way of protecting forms of life. This suggests, more generally, that paying attention to the forms taken by rituals, exchanges, and lifestyle is a privileged vector for entering into their substance. So we said that already when speaking about Asian theology. Asian theology first doesn't care so much about substance. It cares about procedure, ways of engaging the other, of respecting the other, maybe of ritualizing the relationship. And it is sure that the way of being, our way of proceeding, will generate a common knowledge about the way the divine God intervenes in our world, more deeper than the way of articulating faith assertion in a logical, monological way. Though the way you engage with people is the way you are eventually going to meet with God. And actually, what I say makes sense for the whole global community. The fluidity of the dialogical endeavor. I speak of the fluidity because, as I said, rules of the exchange are changing once we develop understanding. The unity of the dialogical endeavor, because when I start to speak with someone, we can always invite someone else to enter. And this is true also for intellectual dialogue. Confucius and Christ dialogue, Mahomet or Chuangzi or Buddha can enter into the exchange that is started. Though the fluidity and unity of the dialogic endeavor allows one to consider all our dialogical attempts, even though modest they may be, as a continuum in time and space. I don't dialogue only for myself or for the little place I'm living in. My dialogue is part of an ongoing dialogue that joins humankind into one. So this continuum links all dialogical attempts into a continuous conversation. Dialogical language games played in various settings explore the extent and limits of our global conversation, which is recorded in text and now multimedia format. We have a whole corpus of dialogues taking place. Dialogue in that sense are never started, never terminated. They appear in sequences that connect into unfinished narrative. We continue today the dialogue between Confucius and his disciple, Jesus is his disciple, Jesus and the woman who asked him to heal her daughter, and so on and so on. So dialogue have started, we enter into it, and those dialogue will not finish with us. Humankind is always nurturing a global conversation, but it is our role in the place we are to nurture, to continue such conversation. It will be richer or poorer because of me. Now, there is something which can be said about dialogue. Doesn't it rely too much on words? Yes, maybe, and this is why actually Asian theologians often speak of dialogue of life. Sometimes just being together and sharing a meal can be a kind of dialogue. So there are some famous sentences in the Analects about that. Confucius said, "I wish I didn't use words." The Gong objected, "Master, if you don't use words, what is there for us, your disciple, to transmit?" He replied, "Well, let me ask you, what does heaven say? And still the four seasons follow their path, and the creatures of the world live their lives. What does heaven say?" In other words, Confucius says we learn from the very fact that we contemplate how heaven works through time and space, through the seasons. And does this compare with the poor words? I can say no, of course. What we learn from heaven is not comparable to the little effect that the word I say to my disciple have. Maybe it's something that can teach us some humility. The first one to speak to the other, it's not us, it's God. And God is speaking to us too. God also wants to enter into dialogue with us. But the availability I will show to the other, the openness I will show towards dialogues, to receive the words and acts and deeds of the others, will help me to open up to the dialogues that God also wants to nurture with me. Another quote from Confucius. He wanted to go and live among the 9 barbarians. Someone said, think of their uncostness. What are you going to do about that? Confucius said, once a gentleman lives among them, what uncostness is there? Here I refer to the example of the Emperor Shun in the Chuangzi, which I quoted last time. Shun is an emperor. He goes among barbarian fishermen, and those fishermen are struggling all the time in order to get the best fishing spot. And Shun says nothing, but his only way of being, the way he controls his senses through the quietness of his heart, slowly will transform the way people behave. They are all gentlemen in some sense. Well, Confucius is saying more or less the same thing, which means we shouldn't concentrate too much on dialogue through words. We should first concentrate on the way we enter the existence of the other with respect, with caution, often in silence, so as to be also transformed by them. We have to be porous, as the Emperor Shun were porous, were open to his environment, at the same time keeping quiet in his own heart, so as to make dialogue valid. My attitude is what prepares the dialogue. The first rules of dialogue are to do with the way I enter into contact with someone, maybe just for a brief visit. When I visit, for instance, a religious place, or maybe for a long time, because indeed in my neighborhood, there are people of all kinds of faiths, and the way we live together will be the best preparation to a dialogue of faith. So I think this leads us back to the main insight found in Asian theological styles. Dialogue is transformative of the interlocutors. Actually, ideally, dialogue is mutually transformative. But as we have seen with Socrates, dialogue also can fail. We have to engage into it. If it is a game, we don't know the result at the end. If it is a play, a theater play, it can be a tragedy at the end. But still, we engage into it. But if dialogue is transformative of the interlocutors, at the end, it transforms reality itself, because reality is shaped by the interaction between everyone, So theologically entering into dialogue is already a way to prepare the coming of the kingdom of God, and though to discover already something of the reality of God. Next week, I will, or more exactly during the next session, I will make this more concrete by speaking about historical forms taken by dialogue, especially in East Asia. So we continue during the next lesson about the same topic, and we'll try to see successes and failures that have affected dialogue of faith and the construction of Asian theology throughout the last centuries. So, see you next time.